Hey, it's ASMR Lobster here, and for this segment, we're just gonna talk about something. We're just gonna ramble about a single subject in the hopes that you fall asleep. And if you, for whatever reason, don't fall asleep, well, I hope you learned something. But today, I'm gonna talk about something that's close, something that's dear to my heart, and that's baseball, specifically American Major League Baseball. And I know, to a couple of you that might seem kind of weird, to a couple of you that might not be in the sports or be certainly opinionated about one sport over the other. It might seem like baseball is on its way out, but I can assure you that that's wrong. In fact, I think baseball is only getting better and better since, at the very least, 2016 and onwards. I know we just had a wonderful World Series, and with the problems going on with basketball and especially football, and I don't really think hockey really ever had it in them to take the number one spot. I think in the next couple of years or so, we can see another serious rise in the sport's popularity. And I think that's a good thing. Because baseball has so much history to it, it has so much magic to it. And what I mean by that is, I don't think in any other sport you can read about players and events and records that have anything close to the same magic and grace that baseball possesses. And I'll talk about that later, but for now, why don't we just go over the teams that make up baseball? There's two leagues in baseball. There's the American League and there's the National League. And it's similar, I suppose, to conferences that you would see in basketball or football. But while those are usually geographical, the National and American League have teams on both sides of the seaboard and in the Midwest as well. And the key difference between these two leagues is that the National League, which is older than the American League, uses the pitcher as a hitter, while the American League, since the, I want to say, the mid 1970s, has used a designated hitter in place for the pitcher. For the argument, the pitcher is not offensively minded. They focus more on pitching. Pitchers usually have very low hits, batting averages, OPS, all sorts of things that just make them, well, downright useless with a bat in their hands. And there are notable exceptions, of course, but you can see through the stats that the American League, with the designated hitter, is offensively better than the National League. But those are the two leagues. And within those two leagues, there are three divisions of the East, the Central, and the West. And why don't we just go through the teams in each division? Well, let's start with the National League West. Why not? There's a lot of history to it. There's 5 teams in the National League West, starting off with the Los Angeles Dodgers, which used to be the Brooklyn Trolley Dodgers way back in the day in the 30s and 40s before they had moved out to Los Angeles. And there's a lot of history in that team. They were quite good in the 1950s and 1960s, where they would oftentimes go up against the New York Yankees, which at the time was a powerhouse. So the Dodgers ended up more as a chew toy than as a champion, but they have a couple of rings from those decades. And then in the 80s, you have the very famous Bob Gibson home run off the Oakland Athletics, and I think they have 2 rings, 1981 and 1988. Since then, they've had a period of, I guess you could say, a drought, but they've been competitive. They were most recently in the 2017 World Series, where they lost in 7 games to the champion Houston Astros. And to the Dodgers' credit, as well as the Houston Astros, it was probably one of the most exciting World Series in probably at least my lifetime. I mean, the earliest World Series I'm able to really remember is 2000, if that dates me at all, but regardless, the Dodgers have a problem of spending a lot of money with very little results. But they'll continue to be a competitive force for years to come off the back of their star pitcher, Clayton Kershaw, which is one of the most incredible players of his generation, as well as younger talent that's just budding like Jacques Peterson and Cody Bellinger, which they weren't really able to produce when it mattered on the big stage. And I think that's more of them being young and still learning the game than them being unclutch or something like that. Needless to say, it's a good time to be a Dodgers fan, to have such a competitive team, and I think going forward they might be able to, make the final push and win a World Series for the first time since the late 80s. Next up is the rival to the Dodgers, and that is the San Francisco Giants, who used to play in New York as well as the New York Giants. No, not the football team, but the baseball team, the New York Giants. And they've also had the problem that the Dodgers have now, but back then, and just being competitive but not being able to make that final push and win a World Series. They have that very famous radio call of the Giants win the pennant, the Giants win the pennant, which you can look up just with those keywords, and you'll get 1,000 videos of the event. That's one of the most, or one of the more magical moments in baseball history. But since the 50s, Giants have had issues since being in San Francisco of just not being able to win a ring. And oftentimes they were downright bullied by their rivals across the bay in the American League, Oakland Athletics, but more on them later. But since turning into the 21st century, they've had significantly more luck in baseball, especially with their dynasty in the 2010s, starting from 2010 to 2012 to 2014. All 3 years, yes, even years, they were able to win the World Series. And while they certainly weren't exciting for the most part, I don't know, I liked the 2014 one, but 2010 and 2012 pretty much put me to sleep. But nonetheless, they've been an extremely successful team in the 2010s, and they are the only team with 3 World Series since 2000 in the National League. And for the American League, that would be the Boston Red Sox, but more on them later. The Giants are probably most famous for their current players, including their tandem, Madison Bumgarner, the pitcher, that can also hit a surprising amount of home runs for a pitcher, as I mentioned earlier, and their catcher, Buster Posey, who's probably the second most well-known catcher in the National League behind Yadier Molina on the Cardinals. The Giants are also famous for their historic players. The most famous, or infamous I should say, is Barry Bonds, who broke Hank Aaron's famous home run record, but allegedly under steroids, which was a massive deal in the late 90s, early 2000s. That it came out in baseball that several of the more prolific players were on steroids. Another one was Roger Clemens, but we'll get to him later. But before Barry Bonds, there was also Willie Mays, which he was a tremendous outfielder for the Giants when they were still in New York. And I actually believe, as a bit of a fun fact, I think Willie Mays and Barry Bonds are related. I'd have to check up on that, but I guess that's kind of interesting because, I mean, before steroids, especially in his Pittsburgh years, I'd say that Barry Bonds was a pretty fantastic player in his own right. Unfortunately, and I know this is unpopular to some of the Bay Area San Francisco fans, but I don't really think the Giants are going to be able to replicate their success they had in the earlier half of the decade. They did very poorly in 2017, and While a lot of the diehard fans would say, well, it was an odd year, it wasn't an even year, and they were suffering with injuries, especially to Madison Bumgarner. I just think that their time in the sun is passing, and they weren't really able to do much this offseason, at least so far. So I wouldn't expect them to put too much of a fight up against the Los Angeles Dodgers and some of the other teams in their division. And the next one that we're going to look at is a personal favorite, not my favorite team, that comes later, but my personal favorite would probably be the Arizona Diamondbacks. And they are an interesting team because they haven't had a lot of success, but they are currently, I think, in the mix to win that division. In 2017, they were able to get to the division series, and while they pretty much got swept under a rug, I still think that they're a very interesting team of a young core and older veterans kind of helping them along. Historically, they're probably one of the youngest teams in baseball, I'd have to say. Older than, I think, the Washington Nationals, obviously, and I think the Rays, or they came about at the same time. I truly forget. Regardless, when they first came in, and this is something that doesn't really happen a lot when a team comes in through expansion, is that they were immediately pretty good, and they were able to make big splashes for big name players and really push for a title, which came in 2001, which is one of the earliest World Series I remember, and probably one of my favorites of all time. It was a 7-game series against the those damn New York Yankees, and it was capped off with a Game 7, I think bottom of the ninth walk-off hit by Luis Gonzalez. But that team is more famous for its pitching tandem of Kurt Schilling and Randy Johnson. And both of those guys are absolutely phenomenal generation pitchers. And I have my own opinions about, uh, I think they should both be in the Hall, but that's a different discussion for a different time, and one that unfortunately becomes political. Now they are good, but throughout the early 2000s, beyond the 2001 title, they, I think, had a fire sale and really sold off all of their fantastic players. I know for a fact that the Boston Red Sox were able to get Kurt Schilling, which I was very happy about as a kid. And spoiler alert, that's my favorite team. And I believe the Yankees got a couple of years out of Randy Johnson before I think he finished his career in Arizona as well. Regardless, after that fire sale, they were a pretty dumpy team, I would say. I don't really think they were able to do much until, again, the 2010s. But they have a lot of good players now. I think their most popular, kind of their face of the franchise type player would be Paul Goldschmidt, who's a just an all-around great player. He's very good in the field. He's a great contact hitter. I think he has some pop to his bat as well. And I think they're trending in the right direction. I would say their pitching definitely needs help. I think they need a legitimate closer. I know they just recently got a closer. That's some 30-year-old Japanese pitcher, but I don't think that's going to work out for them. So I hope that they smarten up and make the right decision to try to get someone this offseason. After that, we should probably go over to the Colorado Rockies, which are an interesting team because they're not really in the West, I would say. I mean, they're certainly Midwest, and they're certainly the easternmost team of the 5 teams in this division. They've had a tough time in their existence because, first off, they play in Denver, Colorado, which is considered the Mile High City. And for those that might not really know all that much about, I don't know, science really, the ball travels a lot further in higher elevations. That much has been figured out. And I believe through the first few years of the Rockies' existence, they haven't had a 1-0 game in Coors Field, and they think they were really, really famous for, just driving the ball and hitting nothing but home runs. It was, pure hell for pitchers, which is why Colorado doesn't really have any famous pitchers that I can think of. They have Ubaldo Jimenez, but he's not good. He had a no hitter, but I wouldn't say he's good. Regardless, they're a good team. Once again, in the 2010s, they're right up there with the Diamondbacks and in kind of the mix, that borderline. Like, I think they can do it. I don't think they can do it. Sense of style that they have, and they get that from one of the best players, I'd say, in baseball right now, which is Nolan Arenado. And I think he's such a phenomenal, like, generational infield player that I just want to see him in the postseason. I think everyone does, just to see what he can really do. But unfortunately, this year they got bounced out of the wild card by the Arizona Diamondbacks. But I think they'll hang around a little bit. Obviously, they need to build up the team a little more, but so do the Diamondbacks. So that'll be an interesting race to see. Historically, they haven't done all that much. They've had one pennant, which comes from their 2007 season, where they had a wicked hot streak, and were able to get right up to the World Series, to when they were swept by the Red Sox. And 2007 is kind of one of the more boring years of World Series. I don't think anyone really thinks too much of it. I mean, I'm happy we got the ring, but I wouldn't say it's really all that impressive. I mean, we're a very good team. I think the Rockies just got hot when most teams were getting cold, and they themselves finally froze up when it really mattered and they were on the big stage. So that brings us to the final team of the division, which is the San Diego Padres. And it's hard to really talk about the Padres because the Padres themselves haven't really done anything. And I say that in the nicest ways possible. I mean, I like the Padres. You'd be hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't like them. They're just kind of there, really. They've had 2 World Series attempts in their history in San Diego, and that's 1984 when they lost to the Detroit Tigers, and again kind of recently in 1998 when they got obliterated by once again, the New York Yankees. And that's a real shame because the team itself, I think, could really use a lot of love. Could really use a lot of fans. I know that's something that they've been struggling to have. I mean, the whole city struggles to keep sports around. They just recently lost their football team, which is a real shame. Nonetheless, I have one of my favorite players growing up, which was Tony Gwynn, and I know, I kind of grew up in the very later half of his career, but he was such a wonderful, funny player. I'm smiling now just thinking about him. I encourage you, if you don't know who he is, to look him up on your own time. But he's just an incredible, lovable player and just an elite talent. He had a close relationship with Ted Williams, actually. And I think he was able to get 3,000 hits, but I'm not entirely certain. Regardless, he's kind of their only player that anybody really knows. I mean, he was Mr. Padre, and to be honest with you, I can't think of any other player like that's known as a Padre. I wonder who's even in the Hall of Fame outside of Tony Gwynn. That's a Padre. And he also did pass away kind of recently to mouth cancer or something similar to that. That was the result of chewing tobacco, and that's terribly sad. And I hate to end this episode on a down note, but that's just kind of where the Padres are at. Just a real kind of weak team that's never really been able to do anything outside of a couple of one-year wonders. But next episode, we'll probably do the National League Central, which has the Cubs and all those other teams that I think people really love. So I hope you appreciated this episode. Thank you so much for listening.